Hey everyone, welcome to 10 Seconds to Air. I'm Alita Guillen. Today's conversation could be the spark that changes your life. Are you living the life you want to live? Do you have meaning and purpose in your life? Are you asking yourself the right questions to be the best you can be in our society? My guest today is Dr. Matthew Croasmun, co-author of the New York Times bestseller Life Worth Living, and a beloved professor at Yale University, where his course, Life Worth Living, has inspired thousands of students to reflect on what truly matters. In this episode, we'll dive into the big questions that shape our everyday decisions and challenge us all to reimagine what a meaningful life looks like.
Stand by. We're going live. We're going live. 10, 9, going live. 7, 6, 5, going live. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Matt, thank you so much for joining me today. This is an important conversation, life worth living. There's a lot that goes into that. I've enjoyed reading your book and really thinking about all of this. So this conversation is really, I want to set the stage, is not to teach anyone what to do or how to live. It's really to get us to think about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so often we jump too quickly to what are the answers, or even how do I implement the answers? And we don't pause long enough to realize actually there's a lot of work in just figuring out how to ask the kinds of questions we're going to talk about today and how to ask them well. So I appreciate that pace.
Yeah.
I think it's really important.
And I have to say, it was a relief to me when I saw how you approach this, that it's asking the questions, because I felt very like, oh, am I not living the right life? Am I not? And it was not, it's not like that. It's more to take the time to really think about certain things and ask those questions. So I'd love to unwrap those questions today and get people to really, me included, think about that life worth living and all the components that go into that. But before we get there, I'm going to ask you what goes through your mind. 10 seconds to air. This is a big topic.
Yeah, 10 seconds to air. Getting ready to have these conversations, maybe my most important personal value is I want to be the same person everywhere. And these questions span a lot of different contexts and a lot of different places.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I enter into any conversation, I'm trying to get back in touch with who am I? Am I showing up as the same person here as I would in any other context? Not that we don't, of course, speak differently to consider our audiences and those sorts of things, but at the core, am I who I am? Am I bringing all of who I am into the space that I've been invited into?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a great, ambitious goal, because there's sometimes I'm not always exactly who I want to be, showing up depending on what's going on.
Sure.
But how do you get there? How do you do that? I think that's part of also that life worth living, is really having that presence in what I've read so far. But how do you get to where you want to be, even for these conversations?
Yeah, I think in part it's, for me, one thing is I think I was performing pace,
Mm-hmm.
being willing to pause and consider. I think so often there's just a real eagerness in our culture to have the right answers, have a good sound bite, have a quick piece. And again, not that we don't want to communicate effectively, but wisdom doesn't always come quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just reading with my students something that the Dalai Lama and his co-author Thupten Chodron wrote. They say, oh, when folks want to talk about progress in meditation, I often have to tell them, like, oh, don't expect to make a lot of progress in just a few years.
Oh, wow.
A few years is such a short amount of time. Don't expect that much progress that quickly. And I just think, oh, that is so different from the time spans that I tend to offer myself and we tend to offer one another.
Yeah.
So I think for me, it's often just a sort of slowing down,
Mm-hmm.
deep breath, a pace. I mean, for me, I'm a Christian theologian, so it's also just my most centering thought is just that that God loves me, that
Hmm.
God loves the people that I'm talking to, that God loves this good world that we have the opportunity to be in, um, and just trying to be grounded in that place of love rather than places of anxiety or fear or
Hmm.
worry or those sorts of things.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's that is just so hard for so many of us because we are in this everyday kind of rat race, but also just so important. I mean, even you speaking right now and taking that time to be thoughtful about the question that I just asked you, I mean, brings down my, anxiety level or my just wherever I'm at, just allows me to exhale. So thank you for that. I mean, I really appreciate that. What inspired you initially to just ask this question?
Mm. I think, I think a couple things. One is, for me personally, I, the first context for me to ask these questions is as a college instructor. Right? So this work originally comes out of a class that we teach at Yale, and for myself as an undergraduate, my experience was that I often took up sort of life's big questions, but I only tackled them in a pretty small, pretty homogeneous community. So, be in
Hmm.
my religious community, we'd maybe talk about the big questions of life, but um, I didn't. I didn't have opportunity to learn broadly from all kinds of people who might answer those questions really differently. I didn't have to do the challenging work of figuring out how to articulate my own convictions to people who didn't share them. So that was one thing that really drew me to this work was giving my students the opportunity that I don't know whether I never had the opportunity, but I never took up the
Right,
opportunity
right. Or a
to
different
engage in
or
these conversations more broadly.
a different way to
Yeah,
phrase it maybe, or just, a different question.
yeah, different
Yeah.
question, and to take it up with people that were coming from really different perspectives potentially
Right.
than
Right.
they were coming from. I think that's so valuable. Learning
Right.
to So much of life is learning to listen rather than learning what to say. And so I love that these questions, I think just if we have half an ounce of humility, these questions will immediately bring us to the place where we realize we don't have all the answers. We are never going to have all the answers. And we're just so, I hope it just like drives us to one another,
Hmm.
because we need one another to try to respond wisely, to kind of the big questions of life. The other thing, honestly, was sort of listening to my students. I think young people are really wrestling with these big questions, and some of that's just appropriate to season of life, sort of mid to late adolescence. They're sort of trying to figure out what they're going to do with what they received from us grown-ups, for better
Yeah.
and for worse. What of that they want to challenge? What of that they want to ask hard questions about? What of that they want to receive and bring forward into the future? What do they need to build brand new because we really messed some things up
Yeah.
as we handed the world over to them? And so I saw them. They wanted to ask these big questions, but they're in the modern university where there's so much about specialized knowledge. It's not always easy to find place to talk about the big questions
Hmm.
and to learn really broadly, not just about various wisdom traditions, but try to learn from them. And so
Yeah.
it's exciting to sort of take up these questions in that context.
So how do you approach and define for, I'll say your students, even for us listening, what life worth living is?
Mm. You mean what
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 is it?
the what the class is or what the questions are, or
Well, what the class is, yeah, I mean, you can
yeah,
start there
sure.
because that is the crux of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Well, let's start
Yeah.
with that. I'm saying what is
Mhm.
a lot of people be maybe listening to
Yeah.
hear that and
Great.
say life worth living, whatever. I got a life worth
Yeah. Of
living. What is that?
course.
But yeah,
Yeah.
and can be cynical
Great.
about it. But if we pause and think about it, what is it that we should be thinking and that you
Yeah.
present to the students?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the question, like, what makes life most worth living, or what makes life worth living, the topic can immediately draw one's mind to, a question like, is my life worth living or something like that? And I often I tell students, I try to within the first 10 minutes of the first day of class, this class is not a class about whether life is worth living, or even worse, which lives are worth living and which
Mm-hmm.
lives aren't. The whole pursuit for me has to take place inside the conviction that all human lives are worth living. And that's important for each one of us. You may have listeners today that are listening and they need to hear someone say that to them. Your life is worth living. And we need to be telling one another that on a regular basis. Um, Really what the question is about for me is, we could maybe rephrase it. What sorts of lives are most worthy of our shared humanity? On the assumption that all of our lives are worth living. Like that's a really extraordinary thing to think that like human lives are worthy. Like what is that? What is that? What do we mean by worthy? And what
Yeah.
is that worthiness? How do we lean into that rather than away from that? How do we live lives um, that put what is most valuable, most worthy about our humanity, and put those things at the center, and let less important but maybe still valuable things sort of find their proper space around it. So for me, it's not about sort of deciding which lives are more worth living than others. It's about exploring the sort of worthiness of this extraordinary and the value of this extraordinarily rich thing that it is to be human,
Mm-hmm.
exploring that together, and then trying to figure out how do we live our lives aligned with that, turned toward that, really celebrating what is, just most to be celebrated about our
Yeah.
humanity.
Yeah. Well, you just said something there. You said a lot there, but I'm picking up on exploring it, right? And
Mm.
then sharing it, which
Mhm.
I think is really an interesting piece of, first of all, exploring it for yourself to say what's worthy, or where do I want to shine my flashlight?
Mhm.
What parts? And then how do I want to go about sharing that? So
Yeah.
can we start with sort of what elements or what questions can we ask ourselves in that exploration piece of it?
So this is a lot of what we try to do in the book is we try to break down this really big question of what is the good life? What is a worthy life? What is the shape of flourishing life? How do we break down that question into smaller pieces that are still big questions, but they're maybe a little bit more, um, something that we can wrap our arms around? So try to ask, some of our key questions are things like, who do we answer to for the shape of our lives?
Mm-hmm.
Like who are we responsible to? Who can call us to account? Who or what? It's not always a who. Um, what does it mean to lead our lives well? Um, what what things are worth hoping for in life? How would a good life feel if we sort of stumbled across one or found ourselves living one? Um, those are all sort of like positive, sort of like on the success path. Like what would like a
Mm-hmm.
really good life look like? But we can also ask questions that are on the other side, so the shadow side of life, right? If we have some account of what it means to lead our lives well, we know we won't always live our lives that way. So we should also be asking questions like, what did we do when we fail to live as we ought to? Or what is if we know what we ought to hope for, or what kinds of feelings we might want in life, we know life won't always go that way or won't always
Right.
feel that way. So what's the role of suffering in a good life? So I'll say like there are lots of these big questions that we can um, wrestle with. Um, and I think again, patience with ourselves is really valuable. Sort of taking a question, going slow, taking time to hear from um, ancient and modern sources of wisdom and from our friends and family and neighbors along the way. Um, there's no lack of questions.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
What comes up as a surprise for you in class when you ask students those questions? How should we feel? Who can call us to account? Leading our lives well. What surprises you? What themes come up?
Yeah, I think students are in many ways these sorts of questions. I say there are lots of these kinds of questions that we can think about, but I think many of them are we're kind of unfamiliar with them. So I think
Yeah.
one thing that I'm surprised by is often that students feel like, oh my goodness, no one has ever asked me that before. Um,
Yeah.
we had a philosophy student early on when we were teaching the course who said, "Boy, I've been studying philosophy for years, and I've studied all kinds of other people's answers to these questions, but
Oh, so
no one has
interesting.
ever asked me what I think
Yeah.
about these questions." I think we maybe tell this story in the book, and it was a real well, it was sort of disappointing to hear even a philosophy student say that. But I think it's just a reality of our life, of our lives. The way that we relate to young people, we're just asking them to produce so much and to, um, I don't know. Yeah, we don't always like put these questions to students. We have a culture, I think, that's really attracted to kind of like how-to questions,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the kind of big what for questions just often don't come. And so, um, yeah, I think it's just a perpetual surprise, and not just with students, but I think all of us as a culture, we sort of um, we are becoming experts with respect to means, but we often remain amateurs with respect to ends. That is, we have much better answers to how-to questions than
Yeah.
we have answers to questions about what for. And so I think some of the surprise is just, oh my goodness, this is so central, and yet we we are so beginners in so many ways when it comes to these fundamental questions.
Yeah. One thing that keeps popping up for me as I'm talking to you and as I was reading through the book and asking myself some of these questions was it's amazing to me when you do stop and ask yourself some of these questions. Um, Things worth hoping for. I mean, it could be any of them. I could pull
Yeah.
up even in the first chapter. Um, how how well for me in particular, how I never ask myself those questions, but number two, how I really there's so much that I'm trying to get through day to day that I don't really answer those questions ever in all that I do. And I can think of some of the most successful people that I know, work with, that don't ask themselves those questions, me included. And if I did, I don't know that the answers really are leading to the life that I'm living.
Yeah.
Um, so how do you counsel that? How do you respond to that? Because I think that that's actually, I don't think I'm that uncommon. I'm going to just throw that out there. Maybe you could tell me, no,
Yeah.
you're an anomaly, but I don't think I am. I think that
Yeah.
if we stop to think about these questions, um, it's pretty common that we're not actually living that life that I don't know, that we really desire, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things going on. One is we could think about we may be hypocrites to put
Hypocrites,
it
is
to
that what
put
you
it
said?
bluntly. Yeah, we may be hypocrites,
Yeah,
right? There's
yeah.
and
I'm okay with
that's
that.
a natural part of being human, right? We have aspirations and goals, and we don't always meet them, even when it comes to sort of the kind of lives we want to lead. And actually, like to some extent, I think some level of hypocrisy is actually a good thing, in as much as it shows that we're willing to hold on to higher standards even while we fall short of them. The
Mm-hmm.
easiest way
Mm-hmm.
to stop being a hypocrite is to lower your standards to match your life. So it actually takes a
Oh,
certain amount of it actually takes a certain amount of like moral courage to like hold on to those standards while you're not meeting them, and to hold yourself to account. So anyway, so okay, so we may be hypocrites to some extent, which is again just to say that we're growing
right, right.
into our values. The other thing is that it may well be that we are living answers to questions that we have never had to like articulate answers for.
Okay.
So in the scholarly world, we'd say we haven't thematized our answers to questions. We haven't been able to like put it into words, but we may have all kinds of wisdom that's just embedded in daily practices that
Mm-hmm.
we're engaged in, and habits and patterns. And so again, sort of again, it's not to say it's not worthwhile to do the work of thematizing and
Right.
articulating all these sorts of things, because often articulating our values can be really, really important when we go through times of transition and certain
Right.
practices go away, and we have to figure out how to like invent new practices that help us sort of embed similar values in new contexts. It can help us resist sort of drift, whether from social influences or other kinds of influences that we want to hold up to our values and not just let them drift with the tide. So articulacy can be helpful for that. I often think of articulation as being a matter of you sort of make a big picture thing like a whole worldview, and you sort of make it bite sized. You can put it in your pocket because you've done the work to figure out, what are my three core values, or what is and that's often the challenge we give students by the end of the class is, can you put your whole vision of a good life into sort of a 3-word slogan, just like three values, right? And that's really valuable. The third thing that is really possible and we should keep on the table is that we live in a world that makes it totally possible to live a life and be told that our lives are very successful, but have it be pretty empty. And that is a real possibility that at some level we may be living lives that um that when we look under the rug, there's some things that we're not happy to
Yeah.
see, and we need to do some of that work, and that's possible too. And so anyway, so all three of those are possible. We may be hypocrites, our practices may be smarter than our ideas,
Uh-huh.
and we may be shallow.
Yeah.
It's okay to
Yeah.
say it that bluntly.
Yeah.
And in all three cases, I think it's valuable to pause and ask these questions and do this work.
Well, I think you raise a really interesting point there. Even though you have those three different options, right? I think that I think that even if you can check those three boxes or 2 out of 3 or whatever it may be, it's okay. And hang with me for a minute here, and then you can elaborate on this. But I feel it's okay to check those boxes as long as you're asking yourself some questions and you're open to sort of reevaluate,
Yeah,
right? Like that's
absolutely.
what this is.
This is my point about hypocrisy, right? Like, I'm not advocating you be a hypocrite, but
Yeah.
it beats some of the alternatives, right? Which, like I said, is sort of like lowering your standards to match your behavior, or just giving up on values entirely. Similarly, like, if you, shallow is such a harsh word. I don't really mean that, right? But if you're like, oh, I'm not as my life is not, my values are not as like carefully articulated and as deeply held as I would like them to be.
Mm-hmm.
But you know that, and you've named that, and you're taking steps to try to do the work to discern those and articulate them and try to put them into practice in your life. Well, that's a wonderful place to be. I think,
Right.
growth is what we're after.
Right.
There's no becoming an expert with respect to life's big questions. Anyone who says they've got it all figured out, you should deeply suspect. Um, and so what we're aiming at isn't perfection. We're aiming at growth, and so much of growth begins with self-awareness, a good degree of humility, and like I said, I think a patience and readiness to listen
Mm-hmm.
to the people around us and to the sources of wisdom, going back centuries and millennia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Have you seen this question about life worth living, a meaningful life, happiness, all of these things? How has it changed over the decades, years, even centuries? Because I don't think my parents, for example, were thinking about life worth living. I feel like it's a question that we may ask more often now, maybe because it's the state of the world that we're in, that we really start to question, or maybe it's age. As you get older, you start really thinking about that. Although young people are really thinking about that now, maybe it's a backlash to COVID. But how have you seen that develop, change, evolve?
Oh my goodness, we could spend a whole hour just talking about this. And I should say it tempts me in one of the more dangerous directions for me to go, which is armchair sociologist. I'm not a sociologist. But it's yeah, no, it's oh, so many things to say. So one thing to say for sure is that I think these questions are especially urgent, let's say in our like century, like in the last
Hmm.
50, 75 years in the West, because a certain amount of consensus about the answers to life's big questions has fallen apart.
Mm,
Um, and and some of that I think is probably helpful and maybe even good. We had a lot of sort of uh, we could say that, so there was a set of answers that had to do with in the anyway, they were like the answers of Christendom, which even as a Christian I can say like didn't always serve the West well.
mhm.
And so in part we can just say like, well, we've had an increase in sort of the recognition and celebration of diversity of approaches to life's big questions, and that's really really good. I think the at the same time, what that has left us is in a place where we're not just sort of born into a world where we can read the answers to life's big questions off of the social world that we inhabit.
Hmm.
If there was ever a world in which, it was obvious that, I don't know, life's big questions were answered in Sunday school or whatever, I don't know, whatever it
Yeah,
was,
yeah,
whatever sort of religious
yeah.
community
In the
that sort
home
of,
or where
or the
your
home or whatever it
morals, your
was, right?
wherever it was. Yeah.
Um, and it's, again, it's good that we have a large, a sort of inclusive, diverse society. It just means that along with that comes the challenge of saying each one of us now needs to answer for ourselves
Hmm.
questions that we wouldn't have had opportunity to answer maybe in generations gone by. And that's an opportunity, but also a responsibility that we have that maybe in certain ways earlier generations didn't have didn't have. Um, I also think that we're going through. We can zoom out even bigger
Yeah.
time wise and say, I think we're seeing a lot of institutions that were built in the West, again on sort of what sometimes sort of imprecisely get called Judeo-Christian values or some such thing,
Hmm.
but also just like large, like lowercase l liberal democratic values that like rule of law is valuable and having elections is really important, and some shared understanding of what justice and equality mean and why they're important, why participatory democracy is valuable. Anyway, all these sorts of things. Again, I think that there were sets of answers. I imagine it sounds like when you go and read writings from 200 years ago, like they were more in touch with the answers to those questions.
Mm.
Like why is it valuable that we live in a democracy? Why is it valuable that we have the rule of law, or whatnot? I think increasingly we have a sense in a world in which like what is good is hotly contested. I think
Hmm.
on both sides, as it were, there can be a sense that like, I don't know. However, we can like we know what's right and good, and however we can get that is probably worthwhile. Dip my toe into political theory for half a second. This might be why we see executive power growing on whether we have a Democratic or a Republican president. A sort of sense that like by fiat we know it's right and good, and we should just make it so. And less a sense that we ought to deliberate with one another and come to sort of shared convictions together. The last thing I'll say, is such a provocative question, is I think COVID really has made, to zoom in a much tighter timeline, I think COVID has had a big impact. And I'd say, you know, 10, 12 years ago at Yale, the sort of question about what is a good life elicited responses from sort of uh, young people who imagine themselves as sort of the heroes of society who are going to go out and change the world and remake the world in some way. And we often were trying to sort of reel reel them back in and help them think about um, I don't know, the smaller things of life, how
Hmm.
you treat your friends, your family, your neighbors. Um, After COVID, I think our students, by and large, they got a sense that the world is nothing is guaranteed,
Yeah.
and their ambitions have gotten much smaller. It has been, how do I secure the sort of job that's going to provide like a healthy safe, stable life for me and my family. And so much less like, how do I take risks and move fast
Right.
and break things and
Yeah.
and launch the billion-dollar company, and more, how do I secure like a safe, stable life?
Well,
And that's a big change in like 5 years.
yeah, that's a big change. And I think that what I have seen, and I have kids that are in that age group, is I
Mm,
have seen this sort of idea that it's, how shall I say? So they're thinking more about those smaller things, we'll say, or those things that are kind of more tangible and not so, I don't know, I'm going to say ambitious, but maybe that's not the right word, but so far reaching and
yeah.
not quite as self-centered as maybe some of those kind of far-reaching things. Are more thinking about community and each other, and that they realize that, wow, I have to spend time on this. Yet at the same time, there's a big question on life worth living. Is this worth it? And it's
Yeah.
a hard answer. It's a hard question to answer for younger people versus as you age, because we have had the experience without COVID of having all that ambition and just kind of going out and doing things and making an assumption that everything's going to be okay. That I'm going to say democracy, and I don't mean it political, but that there is a rule of law, that things are going to be okay. You're going to be okay. Can't say that. You can't say that. I don't know. We don't know if there's going to be another pandemic. We don't know what. Right? There's a lot of questions that we can't answer. And so it's hard to say or to give, your 22-year-old kid a pat on the back and say, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be okay. We also feel we don't know that everything's going to be okay. So we do need to be thinking small.
Yeah.
That's what comes up for me when I hear you say all that it's
Yeah.
harder now than ever to say life is worth living. Everything's going to
Yeah.
be fine.
It's obvious.
Yeah. It's not
The
obvious.
sort of obviousness of the worthiness of life has maybe been questioned. But I think even more what I'm hearing, what you're saying, I think is totally true, is the thought that we just sort of can't guarantee some of the basics of life. And so that sort of I've got everything sort of secured, and so then I can try to like build my projects on top of a sort of assumption of a sort of secure life. Again, we should recognize there are many people in our world for whom that has never been an assumption they
Yes,
could
it's
make.
true.
But I
It's
think
true.
maybe that even more of us feel unable to make that assumption. And we haven't even mentioned the climate,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
young people
Yeah.
also sort of look at that, and that raises these questions. But it's but at the same, so bringing those things into question actually makes these big questions that much more pressing, in a way that it maybe felt like a luxury before to sort of
Yeah.
sit back and ask these questions. And wouldn't it be lovely to spend an afternoon sort of thinking about life's big questions? Now it's urgent. It makes me think. I have as a alum of the college, he's a teacher in Lebanon, and works with children who've been sort of like doubly refugees of two different wars, and working with these young kids, 5 to 12 years old. And she reached out, she's found life worth living really helpful, and I thought,
She's found
oh,
what?
that's
Sorry, say that again.
she's found life worth living
Oh,
really helpful, like the
okay.
book and the
Yeah.
framework and the work that she's doing. And at first I thought, I was surprised by that.
Yeah.
Because I thought, oh my goodness, surely in these sorts of like really with the kind of depth of the needs of some of these kids, I don't know, is it basic math and reading and on you go. And she said, oh, no, in these kinds of environments, social emotional well-being, resilience, and those things so immediately sort of get you right on the threshold, or even right in the thick of some of these quote unquote big questions, that suddenly no longer feel like pie in the sky philosophy, but feel like the basic equipment that we need as human beings to survive in really difficult environments where so many things in life have been called into question. And so I think about her, her students, her refugee students, and I
Yeah.
think actually many more of us, I think, are sort of among them, right? In our own analogous, not equivalent ways, but in our own
Yeah.
analogous ways, also are asking big questions about our lives, because so many of the things that we assumed might always be there for us, we have now had called into question.
Hmm. Can you give a more specific story? I think that that's
Mhm.
really interesting. I'd love to hear more of what she's talking about and
Yeah.
how what kind of questions she's raising
Yeah.
for those refugees.
I mean, I think, sort of, so two quick examples. One is she talked about the question of failure.
Mm.
We in the book are really talking about the question of failure from a sort of almost more moral failure sort of
Hmm.
point of view. But of course, there are more mundane failures or disappointments in life that we run up against, and we need to have some kind of response. And that really, and that's what educational theorists call just resilience, right? And
Yeah.
that's just
Yeah.
so important. um she also talked about, right back to the very first thing that you and I talked about, this fundamental question of our value and our worth.
Mm.
Is my value and my worth in what I can produce, what I can accomplish, how useful I am to other people, or whatever, how impressive I am or whatnot. um those fundamental questions of value, she's found for these kids that she works with. I mean, that's just like, it's just, they're wearing it on the heart sleeve.
Yeah.
They're wearing their hearts on their sleeves, and it's just right there. What am I? Wait, hold on. I need to know that I know that I know that I'm loved
Yeah.
by my parents, by God, by my community, whatever that grounding is. And again, that's not a nice to have. That's a have to have.
Yeah.
And that's always a have to have. But some of us in other kinds of environments, if we set up enough other things around us, we can sort of paper over our lives over a sort of, we can make it look like our lives are working, even if we're still asking fundamental questions
Right.
about
Right.
what is our worth. But these kids who have lived through two wars, had their lives turned upside down, they've really been brought right to the place where they need to know, and they're talking with their first grade teacher, like
Yeah.
in their own language,
Yeah.
about that kind of question. I had an eighth grader here in Connecticut ask me at one point. I was getting ready to, I was going to speak at their oh, best speaking gig ever, speaking at an eighth grade commencement. But so I asked them, like, what are you thinking about? It was a K through 8 school. They were all scattering to go to various high schools. And I asked them, what are you thinking about as you
Yeah.
make this transition? And one of the students said, how do you know that you're worth something?
Oh.
And then I just thought, I mean, that's the most 13-year-old question I've ever heard.
Yeah.
And yet also, oh my goodness, how many of my students don't actually know the answer to that question? How many of my friends and colleagues don't actually know the answer to
So
that question?
how did you answer that? How did you answer that?
Well, I mean, I like I said, I think for me, I think it comes down to something like belovedness. I mean, a colleague of mine at Teachers College Columbia, she's a research psychologist, and she does research on spirituality, and why is spirituality why does it seem to sort of provide so much resilience? And again, it doesn't have to be religious necessarily, but she says spirituality that ends up being protective against suicidal ideation and all kinds of risky
Hmm.
behaviors. She's thinking especially about adolescents. Um, that kind of spirituality, she thinks, boils down to three things: believing that you are loved, that you are held, and that you are guided. And I just think, to me, actually, that just sounds like knowing that you are loved, that you have been loved from the beginning,
Hmm.
that you are held, that you are loved in this moment, and guided, that you will be loved into the future. I just think it's so that sort of question about, yeah, do you know that you know that you know that you're loved?
Yeah.
And there are lots of different sorts of ways of answering that, but uh some of the ways that we, especially, boy, in the elite university environment and in sort of climber society in America more broadly,
Yeah.
some of the answers that we tend to give to that are like, instead of knowing that we are loved, we try to answer, how do I know that I'm worth something, by what do I achieve?
Yeah.
What
What
have
do I
I
produce?
accomplished? Yeah, what do I produce? What do
Right.
people know me
Right.
for? All of that stuff. That's never gonna suffice as an
It's
answer.
interesting that you say that, because I did have I had a guest on this podcast a few months ago who is one from one of the elite schools, and he was really studying kindness, and he
Mm,
was and what his study was showing, I mean, what he was challenged with is that kindness, caring, showing that you are loved and love others
mm, mm,
unconditionally, regardless of background or whatever they're producing and whatnot, valuing each other. What he was struggling with is that the elite universities, the top of the top, don't value it there's no rating for it for success, meaning we raise our kids, we send them to good schools, we
yeah,
push them to go to the best school that they can,
yeah,
we educate them as much as we can, but we don't test them. There's no SAT test that says
yeah,
this is a good person, a kind person, a thoughtful person, people who care
yeah,
about others, love the world that they're in.
yeah,
And that just sticks with me so much, because we can
yeah.
talk about this, but as long as there's no reward for it
Right,
in our society, it's
right.
really hard to then tell kids or each other that there's so
Ugh,
much value, that
yes.
this is so important. And they go, yeah, it is, but it's kind of on the side. It's my
Yeah.
volunteer work. It's my,
Right, right, right.
you know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
no, absolutely. Well, and I'll give you even the yes. Oh, again, so many thoughts. So one thought is to say, there are times when we sort of sum up one another in ways that emphasize precisely these questions of care and love and
Hmm.
concern and
Hmm.
kindness and whatnot, right? David Brooks famously, right, distinguishes between resume virtues and eulogy virtues,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? When if you went to a memorial service and someone was eulogized, with the first, three paragraphs of their resume, that would-
Yeah.
that'd be real disappointing, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to be remembered for our careers. We actually want to be remembered, and we want to remember one another as people who loved deeply and were loved deeply. So that's one tell, right?
Yeah.
And to sort of and try to take on that perspective a little bit more. So that's good. I mean, another thing I hear in that reflection is that we are always in danger in a society that's really obsessed with measurement.
Yeah.
Um, that we are always in danger of valuing what's easiest to measure instead of learning how to measure what we really value.
Wait,
Um,
say that again. I love that. Say that again.
yeah, so we're always at risk of valuing what is easiest to measure instead of learning how to measure what we truly value.
Mm.
And so it is true. It's nigh on impossible to measure um, character, say.
Yeah.
Um, I'm uh, yeah, interviewing the dean of admissions at Yale in a couple of weeks in front of my class. And he and I have been having a conversation. It's actually part of the
Oh,
mandate for the dean of admissions at Yale, that moral character is supposed to be part of what they're looking for.
yeah.
But the sort of founding document, that even just names that as a value back from the 60s, also at the same time says, boy, it's really hard to measure that, isn't
Yeah.
it? Maybe you can just, at some level, that letter is trying to say, look, cheating just can't be excused no matter what. I mean, it's, if you've got evidence to the contrary of, good moral character, let's just not let any amount of intelligence or accomplishment or whatnot outweigh it. So you can maybe do something like that, but it is really challenging. So it may be that actually, in order to truly value what we really think matters most,
Yeah.
we may have to deprioritize measurement in certain ways, just as a society. And boy, you are singing my song as I'm a father of a 15-year-old who's just entering into the college admissions world. It is really hard to tell a young person, what matters most,
Yeah.
isn't what's gonna help you win this game.
Right.
And to say, and at the same time, to feel as a parent, boy, I would love for you to win this game,
Right.
though.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And
It's true.
it's just true. We want to have our cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
But that's why, again, I just fall back on Brooks's thought that there are just maybe two different kinds of virtues or values in our world, right? At least two different kinds: resume virtues and eulogy virtues. And there are contexts in which it is appropriate to cultivate resume virtues, to try to do your work and do it excellently. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah, not at the expense of others or of
Exactly.
of
It's never worth
losing
it
your core values, or it would be wonderful if we could merge the two and be valued for that.
Well, and that's back to this sort of broader social questions. How do we want to live together? And how can we produce a social world in which what matters most is actually what we value most socially? And that's, I think of Confucius, who, Confucius was very concerned about sort of what he distinguished between societies governed by the way and societies not governed by the way. So in a society governed by the way, it would be shameful not to have a good reputation. Because after all, in a good society, in a society where we're valuing the proper things, you should have a good reputation, because good reputation will go to good character.
Yeah.
But in a society not governed by the way, it is shameful to have a good reputation.
Yeah.
Right? Because in a sort of corrupt system that's valuing all the wrong things, if that world is working well for you, if you're coming out on top in that world, you should really pause. And so, one of the most important questions I often ask my students, and I try to ask myself, is, what do we think? Are we living in a society governed by the way, or not? And to the extent to which we are not living in a society that really values what matters most, we shouldn't expect to sort of come out on top. And actually, we should be worried to the extent that we do. But the biggest point that Confucius is really trying to draw our attention to is to say, how can we contribute to the development of a society that is governed by the way? That is to say, build a society in which what we're regularly celebrating together are the things that matter most, and not the things that are easiest to measure, or the flashiest things, or the things that are easiest to put on your resume, or are going to help you win in the attention economy, or whatever it might be. And that's really hard, because that genuinely might come at a cost, if we're living in a world that whose values just aren't quite maybe what they ought to be.
But I really believe that we can make a difference with these conversations,
Absolutely.
with your work, with my work, with getting more word out there to encourage the goodness in people. I'm hopeful. I can't let that go.
So was Confucius. There's something like there's something fundamentally optimistic, right, about the thought that, like, maybe we can actually contribute to a society where his word is humaneness, where what is best about our humanity is what we really celebrate about and alongside one another.
Well, my optimism is that we're in the world that we're in and the place that we're in because we need to make these choices now. We need to think about these things now. The world that we're in is forcing us, whether we wanted to or not, to get there. And we are going to come out on the other side better than we were. All the good things are going to come out on the other side.
Maybe so.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for. Well, what can we leave people with? What practical steps can listeners implement on a day-to-day basis? What do you recommend if we want to really It sounds to me like we need to get to those 3 core values like you teach in your class and say, hey, by the end of this course, we're going to come up with your 3 core values. How do we get people there? How do we get there ourselves to come up with those core values and then hopefully live by them and show up with them as often as we can?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is you need to give yourself the gift of time. There's just no answer to the time. This is like there's just no solving the time problem. We are not too busy for the big questions of life. We are too busy not to answer the big questions of life, right? Our busyness is actually a reason we need to do this reflection. And so now that means you got to find bite-sized, manageable within the busy life of a young parent or whatever stage of life that you're in, right? There are really tough moments. We know time is really, 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 really tough, but we just have to give ourselves the gift of time to do some of this reflection. So I think that means making space to ask yourself some of these fundamental questions. I think our book's a great tool to help you do that. Life Worth Living, lifeworthliving.yale.edu, all kinds of resources there too to sort of go through and ask these questions. I think it's best if we don't ask these questions alone. If we do this together with one another, not just because we'll learn so much from one another, which we will, but also because we can keep one another accountable. This is not a solo pursuit. And then I think we have to be, I'd just say we need to be honest with ourselves. We say, if you want to do one activity you could try today that might motivate you to take up these questions is just take what we call like a life inventory. Look at how you are spending your time, your attention, and your money. Okay. Just write those things down. No judgment. Just make a list. Where are you investing those 3 things? And then step back as a third person looking at that, as someone looking over your shoulder. And again, with no judgment, just ask yourself, given what this person is spending their time, money, and attention on, what does it look like this person believes matters most?
Yeah.
And my hunch is that you'll probably find, as you look at that some of what it looks like matters most, you'll be happy about. Like, yeah, that's great. My kids do matter a lot to me and they do take up a lot of my time or whatever it is. Right? Yeah. But maybe there might be some things there that are a little bit embarrassing. Boy, I'm putting a lot more attention into, I don't know, the New York Times puzzle games or whatever it is that I really think is about what matters most. And there'll be some things you want to change. But I think that's a good first step. And then hopefully that motivates you to find some time, make some time and invite some other folks to do this work with you.
It's a great start. Look, we can't take the class, but we can buy the book, and we can listen to the podcast, and we can start with some of these fundamentals. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work. This has been a great conversation for me. I hope other people enjoy it and take just a little tidbit out of it.
Thanks so much for the invitation and the conversation today.